All right. Our first contention is Iraq. Iraq is about to enter a civil war. Hussein 22 finds that a stalemate between Shiites and Tehran seems to be leading the country towards civil war. Iraq is about to plunge into a civil war that could spill beyond its borders. Luckily, the US can uniquely resolve tensions between the rival factions as they do not support either side. Wahab 22 finds that US officials may be able to affect Iraq's behavior by leveraging its need for international legitimacy. Washington should support proposals to host rival Shia factions for dialogue, a post that can play a potent moderating role in Baghdad. Indeed, FAF22 confirms that by engaging a wide range of Iraq subgroups to not just find, the US can create a way ahead and increase the value of cooperation for all sides. US engagement could prove profitable. This is critical now as TNN22 corroborates that Iraq, a neighbor, faces dangerous levels of instability. And now, both countries appear to be entering a particularly dangerous phase, which only high-level, focused diplomacy can solve safely and lastingly. And however, unfortunately, absent this diplomacy, civil war is inevitable. Twaj22 finds that Iraq is nearing the brink of a Shiite civil war. The increasingly violent rivalry between polarized political wings could dissolve into all-out internal warfare given the heavily armed population, and civil war would spill over. Ferguson06 finds that the escalating civil war in Iraq has the potential to spill over into neighboring countries like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. And according to Brown 22, in past Middle East spillover conflicts like Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan, 387,000 civilians have died of violent deaths as a result of these wars. Our second contention is the Iran nuclear deal. Trump abandoned the Iran nuclear deal. Robinson 22 finds that under the Iran nuclear agreement, Iran agreed to dismantle much of its nuclear program and open its facilities to more extensive international inspections in exchange for billions of dollars worth of sanctions relief. However, the deal has been in jeopardy since President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from it in 2018. Iran has resumed some of its nuclear activities. The reimposing of sanctions after the deal's failure supercharged conservatives' narrative and brought them to power. Salehi 22 finds that President Rouhani, who served from 2013 until 2021, promised moderate social policies, as well as repairing relations with the West. However, after the failure of the nuclear deal and sanctions were imposed in 2021, frustrated hardliners engineered the election of a deeply conservative cleric, current President Ebrahim Raisi, whose task would be to deliver a traditionalist government, which the hardliners hoped would deliver economic prosperity at home and cement Iran's position as a regional power, turning Iranians away from the West. When prosperity failed to materialize, the hardliners blamed Iran's poor economic performance on Western sanctions. The conservative regime has used these sanctions to fuel its fire. Sulami 21 finds that Iran has recently launched a barrage of threats and accusations against several external actors, which it accuses of being behind the protests that have erupted across the country. To begin its quest to spin lies and distract attention, the Iranian regime targeted the US and Israel. Tehran wishes to direct its internal crises outward by inciting tensions with neighboring states through the use of its proxy actors. Thus, CFR 22 finds that as Iran advances its nuclear program and trains proxy forces throughout the Middle East, the potential for conflict continues to increase. Although Biden has moved back towards Iranian diplomacy, he has only engaged in low-level stop-and-go talks. Robinson 22 finds that renewed diplomacy initially seemed promising, but after stop-and-go talks, it remains unclear if the parties can come to an agreement. But Morgan 22 finds that the U.S. approaching from the lens of diplomacy would help forge a path to a new deal. U.S. diplomacy may reduce some of the U.S.'s local military capability in exchange for limitations on Iranian missile and proxy strikes. Iran would have many incentives to uphold this bargain. Both sides have an interest in talks, but reaffirmed diplomacy is necessary. International Crisis Group 22 says that though the parties remain nominally committed to continuing diplomacy to restore the 2015 deal, an escalatory cycle looms should the talks meander aimlessly or end in failure. A pathway to a deal still exists. However, absent peace, Iranian aggression could devastate West Asia. Stewart 22 finds that Iran could be incentivized to escalate attacks if it views the U.S. as less committed to protecting its interests in the region by increasing proxy forces in Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, and Syria and threatening the U.S. partners and allies. And should this aggression continue, nuclear war could occur. Bowser 20 finds that hostile Iranian activity through its proxies would mean that even a minor miscalculation could lead to a major war in the Middle East. And mutually assured destruction may be inapplicable because Iran's defiance of logic in the nuclear context, which could lead the world into nuclear war. Vote F.
All right. You guys said your case.
What did I think?
You guys said your case.
Wait, do you want us to start your case?
Oh,
if you guys want.
if you can, if you want.
If you don't want
to,
to, that's totally okay.
I'm sorry, we're a little bit uncomfortable with that. So
That's totally okay.
if that's fine with you guys.
Totally okay.
But if you guys think it's unfair.
No, it's we disclose it anyway.
Okay. Everybody ready? Judge ready? Participant ready? In the corner?
Yes.
Perfect. Zaki and I negate. Resolve, the United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. Professor Stephen Walt of Harvard University confirms that America is convinced of its responsibility to spread democracy to the far corners of West Asia through violent military force in countries like Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Political division within our borders has fostered instability abroad, as Walt furthers that Democrats and Republicans have become hopelessly polarized, with both sides encouraging radical foreign policy similar to America's strategy in the Vietnam War. The nuts and bolts of American diplomacy are defective, as Walt explains that the Department of State, responsible for foreign relations, is founded on a perverse incentive for diplomats to draft solutions that put America before regional peace. Overall, Fearney 21 finds the U.S. creates biased treaties in favor of allies which make conflict resolution impossible. For example, the Journal of Palestine Studies finds that the Oslo Accords, aiming for peace between Israel and Palestine, failed because the U.S. crafted an unfair agreement that prioritized Israel's interest over Palestine's. For these reasons, Kenwick 14 concludes that diplomacy with interference from the U.S. is 94% more likely to fail. In that context, our first contention is redlining. Throughout history, SAC 22 confirms that American presence in West Asia has been too much or too little, but current efforts have created a Goldilocks zone. US IP 22 writes that Biden is benevolently supporting multilateral agreements between Israel and the Gulf states while also avoiding confrontation. Unfortunately, increasing diplomacy would risk overextending our influence, repeating the mistakes of the past. Oster 13 writes that since the Obama administration, American foreign policy has relied on red lines, which are limits to what an adversary can do before we retaliate with military force. These efforts are doomed to fail, as Altman 22 writes that adversaries like Iran overstep boundaries to avoid seeming weak, and America lacks the incentive to retaliate, which damages our credibility. In 2014, for example, the US didn't respond to Bashar al-Assad's usage of chemical weapons in Syria. This enticed Russia to invade the Ukrainian peninsula due to the perception of weak American commitments. Preventing redlining is key, as West Asia is a litmus test of American credibility, which Brands 22 assures holds the global order together by deterring our adversaries from starting costly wars of ambition. As a result, Lauter explains that the number of deaths due to conflict has declined by 90%, and reliable American deterrence has prevented wars between great powers, saving hundreds of millions of lives. Our second contention is regionalism. Ani 21 warns that with the US moving out of the Middle East, leaders in West Asia are being forced to bury the hatchet with their previous enemies, as they realize they no longer have the US's protective shield. Kaplan 21 finds that since the US has shifted away from the Middle East and Biden's regime has ended its security guarantees to West Asian allies, the major regional powers of Saudi Arabia and Iran have begun to hold secret talks without US involvement, with the Saudi crown prince declaring that they are seeking to have good relations with Iran. Kaplan continues, finding that this shift in relations between the two countries is due to the recognition that the US is moving away from the Middle East. Regional diplomacy has succeeded, as Parsi 20 finds that due to the decreased US involvement, Saudi Arabia has begun negotiations with the Houthis, decreasing Saudi-led airstrikes by 80%. The impact is peace. Velasco 13 finds that regional organizations are 6 times more effective at creating durable agreements. And creating peace is imperative, as Fisher 16 quantifies that Saudi-Iran future civil wars could kill 5 million people. And as such, Zaki and I are so proud to negate.
Can I see some evidence?
Yeah, sure.
Can I see the 94% part at the bottom of your overview? And then on C2, can I see that the secret talks are being held because the United States withdrew?
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Just ready? May I have the first question?
Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about this Iranian nuclear deal.
Yeah.
All right. So wasn't Iran actually violating this nuclear deal while it was happening?
Trump claimed they were. Generally, the IAEA, the International Association of Atomic Scientists, didn't really believe that. It was mostly just an excuse for Trump to pull out of the deal and pursue his America First policy.
Wait, why does Iran want to re-enter this Iranian nuclear deal?
Because they don't want sanctions?
Well, how badly are sanctions affecting the regime currently?
Clearly pretty bad, considering the protests going on right now.
Don't you think the protests may be unrelated when a woman was killed?
Yes, but why do you think that Iran has such conservative social policies? Because they're trying to distract from the actual issues of economic problems, right? Like what we're saying is that the sanctions give conservatives, the same conservatives who are trying to like oppress women right now, the entire reason they came into power is because of sanctions. Because when you give them something to be angry about and to get the population angry about, that's what conservatives get their narrative from.
Well, but Iran has had the same leader for the past 30 years, correct?
No.
Hasn't Khomeini been the supreme leader for the past 30 years?
No.
All right, sure. Let's go into another
So
one.
can I ask you a question about, can I ask you a question about redlining?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you say that red lines involve military retaliation, how is this like part of U.S. diplomacy, peaceful diplomacy?
So red lines. So the act of like promising we will retaliate can result in peace, right? You're not doing the troops on ground initially, right?
Yeah,
and
but
that's
okay,
how
wait,
Obama
hold
did
on.
peaceful
Hold on.
diplomacy in terms of trying to
But-
dissuade other countries.
So,
from doing it.
but how is threatening military force peaceful diplomacy? Like that just isn't really topical, right?
Look, security is the basic currency of all diplomacy and foreign affairs. Insofar as that is true, military is going to be a little bit of a part of that.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So, but I understand that you're claiming that military is the currency of diplomacy, but then how does that like interact with the resolution, right? Even
Well,
if you
'cause
make
then
the
the
claim
United
that
States
currency
has-
is diplomacy, you still have to deal with the fact that the resolution specifically specifies peaceful diplomacy.
And we're not saying that we'll encourage a war from happening. You
Well,
got to
you are.
leverage your resources in order to
You're
prevent
specifically
said war from
saying
happening.
part of U.S. peaceful diplomacy is threatening to use the military. That's not peaceful.
Yeah. Well, to initiate peace, sometimes you got to use the leverage that you have.
Okay,
Right?
so
and that is a large part of
let's be
diplomacy.
specific. So
All right.
we're doing
Sorry,
peaceful
we've been talking about
diplomacy
this for like
by
10
we're doing peaceful diplomacy by threatening military force. Okay, can I ask another question?
Sure.
Okay, so on regionalism, like is
Yeah.
the GCC a regional organization?
Yeah, and it hasn't been very effective because of U.S. involvement. Like, you've not seen many things been resolved.
Okay, let's look
During
at
this
like
entire
let's
thing.
look at like other regional organizations, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Like what about ASEAN? Like has ASEAN been successful without like U.S. presence?
I would say so.
Okay, so why is Singapore and other countries in ASEAN like begging the U.S. to come back because they're so weak without them? Like let's look at other regional organizations when the U.S. wasn't there. Were they successful?
Well, the issue here is with the United States involvement, especially with all the bias we see in the region, like bias towards Israel, bias towards
So
Saudi
is bias
Arabia.
always bad in negotiations?
Absolutely. You
Okay.
see how it panned out with stuff like the Oslo Accords, but that's
All right,
time.
that's cross. All right, you sure you good? Yes, you good?
Yes.
I'm gonna read the card I told you.
I don't know, maybe.
Please, bro. It's good.
Think about it.
What's the tag?
What's the tag?
The secret talks of Alto.
Oh, I got you. Secret document. Let's get started with an overview. They go into their case. And the overview will be like kind of responding to, man. Right.
So it'll be responding to our case.
I hit my knee. Yeah, it'll basically be responding to, dude, I hit my knee so many times.
So you're responding to our case and then responding to our case?
Well, it's gonna be an overview. And I'll be implicating it as like it'll be on their case. Right? This is not it won't be fast, it won't be very complicated.
Okay.
Anybody know? As an overview, the United States pullout from Afghanistan has marked a fundamental shift in our foreign policy. Catullus 22 tells you that the new approach is more cautious than the previous administrations. Indeed, the United States has now sought to put diplomacy first. But while an important first step, increased diplomacy is still required for issues. Indeed, Morgan 22 finds that the United States should revitalize its diplomatic engagement with Arab and Israeli partners. This argument has become really crucial as we go. I'll be implicating it. But at the start, they cite this Harvard professor who specifically talks about the negative impacts of U.S. military involvement. Affirming does not mean military intervening. A, because the resolution literally says we're going to be peacefully intervening, but B, because the United States does not resort to those tactics anymore. Then, on their overview, they've said that U.S. diplomacy has been ineffective in the past. We'll say fine. The U.S. diplomacy may have been bad in the past, but that's because we've prioritized military engagement over actual talks and actual peace. Lastly, they tell you that the United States is exceptionally biased and that impedes our mediation efforts. The source they cite for this is the Journal of Palestine, which is talking about their own conflict, so obviously they're going to have a negative view of the country that's supporting Israel. It's not an objective source. Lastly, on this thing that there's like a 94% chance that these regional organizations fail. This evidence is terrible. 1, it's not talking about the United States. 2, it's not about West Asia. 3, we would argue that 3, remember that, or the evidence that they cite, the 94% thing, is talking about military intervention as a precursor to peace talks ending up failing. The argument we're going to go for is the one of the reality where the United States is just going to be talking, there's no military intervention. With that being said, let's go to their specific arguments. Start on redlining. Remember, Judge, that the NEG is inherently advocating for the status quo. That's the world that they've told you that countries are consistently breaking red lines. That's crucial because if countries are already breaking red lines, that means that affirming or negating probably doesn't change anything. But we would argue that if you actually want to solve back for countries stop breaking these red lines, you should affirm. That's because if you affirm and you resolve these internal armed conflicts, the conflicts that are breeding belligerent actors, the ones who are more prone to break these red lines and then force a response, you're solving back for these regimes, you're instituting democracies into these places, and you're getting rid of these belligerent actors, which means the affirmative solves for the root cause of the redlining. But then, remember what Daniel brings up in Cross. A, the resolution is talking about peaceful intervention, so we're not going to have these military retaliations. But B, even if that was true and we were going to, under the aft world, because of the fundamental shift in U.S. policy, we won't see any military retaliation. Their argument here is generally very not topical. Also, lastly on their thing where they say that West Asia is this litmus test for the world, there's a couple problems. There's no actual explanation of what West Asia being a litmus test means. They don't explain they don't explain what this litmus test is, the implication on the general world or U.S. foreign policy. There's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of vagueness. You shouldn't feel comfortable voting. On their next argument about regionalism, remember again what Daniel tells you in Cross. Regional organizations like the GCC and ASEAN have been unequivocal failures. The GCC invaded Yemen, and thus far they haven't been able to provide you a single example of what they've done well. We would argue that the United States actually fosters better regional alliances. That's because Fever 17 tells you that U.S. alliance guarantees a climate of security which fosters a peace in which America and its partners can flourish. The United States as an overarching actor in the region is the best way to peace. In the past we've prioritized militaries, but now we're prioritizing peace, which is why now we're uniquely good. Then, we would argue that they say that there's secret talks being held. Our evidence indicates that these secret talks have been stopped, which means the world they're advocating for has no talks. Lastly, I want to think about this 80% decrease in drones. That was about the United States withdrawing their military presence. It's not topical, nothing to do with diplomacy. Affirm.
Cool. All right. Is anybody not ready for my speech? The order is just going to be going down my case and frontlining their responses, then I'll go to their case and I'll respond. Okay. Start at the top. On our overview, we're going for our second link in our overview about biased treaties, where we explain to you that the United States in its current position is going into West Asia with biased treaties in favor of its allies. That ultimately links us into the 94% card that gives you the analysis that any actor that intervenes will have a 94% chance of their diplomacy failing. He unloads a couple of bad responses, the first of which is saying that it's not intervening because it's peaceful intervening, but peaceful intervening is still intervening nonetheless. Our 94% card still flows through. But second, he says that the evidence isn't about the U.S. or West Asia. Yes, it's a completive study that explains to you that when an actor intervenes, in this case the United States, into a foreign territory, in this case West Asia, we see that 94% of the diplomacy fails. At that point, we look to their overview where we see that Afghanistan is not within West Asia and their overview doesn't flow through. On red lines, we agree with them that red lines are happening in the scroll, so we effectively kick out of red lines. This is not what we're going for. We are going for our second contention about regionalism, where we explain to you that when the United States pulls out their protective shield from the region, countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to have to sort their differences because they need a security guarantee. That's happened before, as we've seen Saudi airstrikes decrease by 80% in history when the United States pulled out of the region. Now, a couple of really bad responses again from their side. First, they say that the GCC and ASEAN are failures. Remember, the GCC, first of all, is a failure because of the United States. But second, remember that ASEAN isn't even near the region. Plus, we'd argue that they're cherry-picking these two examples out of what our evidence explains to you, that there is a 6 times more likelihood that regional alliances are more effective than actors like the United States in this exact same scenario. For those reasons, you know that the United States is not the mediator that the West Asia needs. Instead, it only exacerbates the problem in the first place. Thus, we get access to our 5 million deaths that occur from Saudi airstrikes that wouldn't have been prevented without the U.S. pullout. Plus, they give you this argument that Iran has been talking, but realize that that regionalism has stopped Iranian talks for the past 6 years. We'd argue that's still good enough. Let's move on to their side of the floor. On contention 1 about Iraq. As a brief overview, all of their evidence on Iraq argument is terrible. They bracket the words Iraq when their evidence is only referring to general diplomacy. There are a few key reasons why the U.S. cannot solve Iraqi civil wars. First, the U.S. installed the current government, but we have vested interests in keeping them in power. And second, Iraq is currently a 50-50 Sunni Shia state, and the U.S. cannot afford a Shia win in the region because it would spook Saudi Arabia and cause Iranian expansion, so we will always help the Sunnis. Third, the U.S. needs access to its forward operating bases in Iraq, which will only happen if we support the government because its Sunni nationalists want no U.S. intervention. These responses have 2 main implications. The first of which is that the United States will intervene to solve the Iraqi civil war with or without increasing diplomacy because we have vested interests. Second, they function as turns because the United States is incapable of providing unbiased mediation in the potential conflict. That means that when the opposition parties will be more incentivized to seek external security providers like China and Iran, which increases the likelihood of proxy conflicts that could kill millions. Next, you can turn their argument to our side because the reason Iraq is on the verge of civil war right now is because the United States spent 8 years in national building after the Second Gulf War. It was a part of diplomacy. This means that even if they win this argument, at best, they solve for a problem they created. Let's move on to the Iranian nuclear deal. This argument is also wrong for a couple reasons. First, despite U.S. efforts, the deal will always fail. As David 22 explains that Khomeini prohibited Iranian diplomats from negotiating directly with the United States. This has 3 implications. First, Iran does not want to appear weak to its regional circle by accepting U.S. terms. Second, accepting the deal would alienate Russia by lowering global oil prices, and Russia is a key customer for Iranian arms. And lastly, Iran is perpetually afraid of Israel's nuclear arsenals, and accepting non-proliferation would prevent them from acquiring its return. Thus, for all these reasons, we'd argue that nuclear war would never occur because in the 80 years we've had nuclear wars, there's been no instance of miscalculation. Thus, we negate.
Okay, you ready for this?
Yeah,
Cool. That's your first question?
go for it.
Okay, your Parsi evidence, what's the reason for the 80% drop in strikes in Saudi Arabia?
It comes after the United States pulled out
Pulled out what?
of the region.
No,
Diplomacy.
no. Specifically what? Was it military
I
engagement?
think we sent you that card, right?
It was read on like the TOC 2020. It was like the biggest card in the TOC 2020.
So can you tell me what you're trying to prove?
Your 80% card is about the United States withdrawing its military presence. The United States
Yes, and
It's
military
not- it's
presence is directly related
No.
to leverage, as we explained to you, which is needed for diplomacy. The
Okay.
card
well,
is not specifically talking about military presence, but you can indict it later. Can I have a
So-
question?
Can I take follow up?
Sure.
If the United States is going to be doing peaceful diplomacy, why would we increase our military?
Because why would any country listen to someone that doesn't have a military? Do you
Well,
think the
I mean,
Uni-
like-
Can I finish?
Sure.
Do you think the United States would do peaceful diplomacy with Sri Lanka, even though they know they could beat their ass in a second? I mean, come on. You
look,
have to have a military
like-
if you want to have leverage.
we're having a
in
pretty-
order to have leverage, you need to have.
We're
a
having a
military.
pretty nice discussion right now, and I don't think either of us have militaries to hold over the other person's head. Like we can still, you can talk to someone without having a military behind your back. You don't need like in order to send 5 diplomats, you don't need like a military.
Okay, can I have a question?
Of course you can.
All right. You say that nuclear war is going to arise from the Iranian nuclear deal, right?
Probably.
So what would
It'll
this?
be either be a conventional or a nuclear war.
Who will this war be between?
It would probably pull in the United States and Russia and maybe China too if they want to
So
get
all
peace.
because Iran nuclearized?
Yeah. Or other states will start proliferating because they get scared. I don't know. Can I take a question?
Sure.
There's a lot of scenarios here, and I also can't predict the future.
Okay.
Okay. So you say that the GCC is bad because of the United States.
Yes.
So are they good now because there's no United States?
They're better.
They're better? Okay, what have they done? Like, what's
Not-
one thing they've done? If
They
they're
haven't
so
done
great?
anything bad. That's why I'm arguing. You would agree that they weren't the best with the United States, right?
Who? I would argue they're
GCC.
pretty bad because they're just ineffective at conflict resolution.
Okay. Are they still bad at conflict resolution?
Well, clearly, yeah. I mean, there's like Iraq is about to break out into a civil war.
So then has anything changed?
No, that's my point. My point is that you're the neg. You're advocating for the status quo. If you're advocating for the world in which the
We're-
GCC sucks, that's probably not a good thing for you.
We're advocating for the status quo, but also we're advocating against the affirmative, right? So if the status quo is bad, but the AF is worse, we still win the debate.
Yeah,
So
but the AF might have been worse than like if this was like 5 years ago and the United States wanted to increase its diplomacy then, I'd totally be like, yeah, I'd probably be negating every round, even on that. But the United States is different now. We've changed.
Yeah,
We no
because,
longer-
because you think that the military is now not.
It's
leveled
not.
with
That's the evidence I
United
read
States
you at the
diplomacy,
top of my case that you just didn't really respond to.
We did
Oh yeah,
respond to that
dude.
by
Okay,
saying-
can I ask you a question? How is
You actually just
Afghanistan
asked the
not
question.
in West Asia?
It's not.
How is it not?
I'll pull up a map right now and I'll show you that Afghanistan is not in West Asia.
Afghanistan is
It's
in West Asia.
It's
Are
in
you
the
the one
Middle
that's
East.
around on it?
Your ANI evidence at the top of your red line or your C2 is talking about Afghanistan Palo.
You can show that to me.
I cut the card.
We did too.
No, I know, but it's talking about Afghanistan.
Okay.
I mean, if you're gonna make that argument.
Let's go.
Okay, I believe.
I'll start now. Yeah, I know what it is, right? All right. I'll be starting on like this kind of just like the overview about like pull out and like Afghanistan and stuff. Then I'll go to Iraq, or sorry, well, I'm gonna kick out Iraq, but I'm going to Iran and then their stuff.
Wait, what's the order?
Overview Afghanistan and then Iran and then their stuff. All right. Yeah. All right. Everyone ready? Yeah, I go well. All right. Starting on this overview about Afghanistan, right? It doesn't really matter about Afghanistan and whether it's in West Asia or not, because it's a signal of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and most West Asian countries are in the Middle East. So Afghanistan marked a great shift in U.S. policy, and this is what the Catullus evidence says, and they haven't provided any counter evidence. The Catullus evidence shows that the U.S. is specifically focusing on peaceful diplomacy with no military troops and no nation building whatsoever. This completely counters all of the examples they cite, most of which are about the U.S. using military force or using nation building. Also prefer the card over an analytic. Also, it's not even the, okay, now going on to the Iraq, they try to leave turns, but we can see that the U.S. is going to intervene either way. That kicks them out of any sort of turns that or offense that they have on Iraq. Now go to Iran. The first response they give you is that it's going to alienate Russia. This isn't really implicated. Russia's already like weak and angry at us because of Ukraine. They're not actually going to like do anything or change anything because they physically can't. They just don't have enough troops. Then they say that like Iran is afraid of Israel, but Iran is clearly not afraid of Israel because they're still talking in the nuclear deal. We specifically tell you that Iran is resuming talks with the United States and there's a possibility for a deal. There is a path to a deal in the status quo. We need to increase diplomacy to actually take advantage of that path. Like, Iran is willing to go for a nuclear deal because they're so heavily sanctioned right now. There's so many protests. They need to resolve some of the internal issues or else the regime is going to, get deposed. So they're willing to stop. But in the status quo, if we don't do anything, they're continuing to become more aggressive, they're repressing protesters, and this is all because of sanctions. The entire reason that they're actually doing these repressive actions against women in the current status quo is because there's currently sanctions on Iran, and so the government is trying to distract away and suppress other groups so that they can maintain power because they know they can't maintain power through democratic means or just through the support of the people. So the entire reason why all the conservatives gaining power and repressing protesters that they talk about is occurring is because Iran is becoming more unstable due to sanctions. The only way to solve this is to sign a new nuclear deal. Remember, conventional or nuke war, because mutually assured destruction doesn't apply. This is the first conflict that involves such an irrational actor. And existential threats outweigh. It's the only impact you should vote for in this round. The Global Priorities Project of Oxford University explains that cognitive biases lead people to underestimate existential risks. And since there have not been any catastrophes of this magnitude, these risks are not salient, so we need to reverse this grim trend. Prioritize your ballot on who links best into nuclear war. Now, onto their overview. They say bias mediation is bad, but in fact, bias mediation is key in conflict negotiation because it ensures that the U.S. has a stake in the outcome and is equipped with knowledge to stop the conflict. Stark 18 concludes that a rich body of scholarly research shows that bias mediators can play conducive roles in negotiation to end civil wars. They say U.S. diplomacy was bad in the past and that U.S. is 94% likely to fail. This is only after military presence as a precursor. All their evidence is about military. Now onto redlining, they drop the term that affirming stops bad actors which break red lines. And now on regionalism, the GCC hasn't done anything, and they completely drop the turn that the U.S. actually improves security by helping regional actors develop better regional alliances. This is terminal defense and actually a terminal turn on their case. The fact that they don't respond to the fact that we actually link into regionalism concedes them the entire case. Also, secret talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran have stopped. Regional actors are not working. There's no uniqueness here.
Okay. Start our case. Well, actually, yeah, our case, their case. Time will start. Ready? Ready? Great. Time will start now. Let's start on our overview where we tell you that American bias ultimately rips up any shred of possibility for the United States to actually solve any treaties. The Fearney 21 card just goes completely unrefuted throughout today's round, which is that essentially the U.S. is biased in its treaty building, and it has been biased in the past and will continue to be biased. And that's why Kenwick 14 finds that ultimately that means that there's a 94% chance, more likely, that when the United States is involved, ultimately these treaties are going to fail. We've seen this empirically. Look at the Oslo Accords. That was completely peaceful, yet we completely backed Israel, and that's what caused it to go down the drain. This is really, really important because they can't get any impact on their case insofar as agreements are never solved for. Now let's go on to our second contention about regionalism. This is the single most important contention in today's debate. They give a couple of responses. None of them are good. They say that the United States fosters the security alliances. Understand that the reason why there's so much tension in the Middle East, as we explained in case, is because the U.S. gives security to Saudi Arabia and other states like it. And that's what emboldens them to then go out and not make negotiations with Iran and instead attack. That is why when the United States pulled out and lifted those security guarantees, ultimately that drew them closer to Iran. We tell you this in case with the Ani 21 card, which says that when the United States moved out, ultimately Iran and Saudi Arabia had to go together, and that's why you saw talks happen for the first time in 6 years. So, ultimately, this is really important because these talks resulted in actual gains, as negotiations between the Houthis ultimately decreased airstrikes by 80%. This regionalism ultimately solves 6 times more than anything they can bring up. Now, let's go on to their case. On their first contention about Iraq, extend the turn that we tell you that because of the United States' bias, that ultimately forces the other side to reach out to other powers, such as Russia and China, ultimately increasing insecurity in the region and leading to more proxy conflicts, ultimately leading to potentially millions dead. This is really important in today's round. Let's go on to the second contention about the Iranian nuclear deal. They concede the defense that we bring to you, which is ultimately that Iran's key partner right now is Russia. That's kind of who's backing the regime. That's who's buying their weapons. That's a large part of their economy. If they alienate Russia, then ultimately they'll be alienating themselves from a lot of their allies. And insofar as that is true, they have no reason to do the Iran nuclear deal. They don't really give a response to this. The only response is that Russia is not powerful. Russia funds a lot of the Iranian government. It doesn't matter whether or not Russia is powerful. Now, let's go to weighing. Ultimately, understand that nuclear war has not happened in the past 80 years, and a miscalculation has not happened even with such unpredictable actors such as North Korea or Russia in the past few years. Insofar as that is true, the probability of that is 0, whereas you have seen wars erupt in the Middle East due to U.S. involvement, and the only solvency is going to be through regional organizations, which are 6 times more effective at solving such. As such, on the probability debate, the strength of link, we win.
All right, ready for Grant?
Sure.
Grant's first question.
Sure.
Okay, so, if Iran has no reason to, actually want to do the Iran nuclear deal, why are they participating in talks?
Well, so why was it passed before?
Yeah.
If they're never gonna...
Yeah, Russia's an ally of Iran, but if anything, Iran would be looking to shift away from Russia right now, because, Russia's kind of a crappy ally.
Russia's been very reliable in recent years.
Iran is literally selling... Russia is so weak in Ukraine that... Okay,
wait, that's fine. If you've given us as many warrants in the world as why they'll never do the deal, why was it passed before?
Well, because they wanted money to create nuclear weapons, right?
Wait,
but the whole point of the treaty was that they couldn't create nuclear weapons, and then independent investigators
looking back,
watched over
it's a little bit late in the round, but looking back at the JCPOA, looking back at the JCPOA agreement,
sure,
right? So it set limits on how much nuclear enrichment they could get per year, right? So, and then it ran out at some point with a cap out enrichment level, which ultimately meant that in the future, Iran could continue enriching up to that level of the nuclear weapon. It never ever stated that it would.
It was
end it forever.
Limiting their nuclear capabilities so they couldn't develop nukes.
Also, this is new from you.
Yeah.
This is new from me, but you guys wanted an explanation.
Okay. If all of your arguments are true that they'll never do the deal, it should have never been passed in the first place. The evidence that we read you in case tells you that diplomacy in the past worked. It worked because we were able to pass the deal. The only reason the deal failed was because Trump pulled us out.
Do you think that how do you think that the only reason that the deal failed is because Trump pulled out? If Iran was secretly activating its centrifuges when
they weren't secretly activating their centrifuges. That was Trump's excuse to get us out of the deal.
Wait, so that was Trump's versus whose word? Okay.
That was Trump promoted an America First foreign policy. Trump and many conservatives create threats, right? Like think about like Bush saying, "Oh, look, there's WMDs in Iraq," right?
Fear-mongering, yeah.
Yes. So that's exactly fear-mongering. Trump's like, "Oh my God, Iran is like reaffirming their centrifuges. They're gonna like do nukes. Let's pull out of the deal. Oh my God."
It's fear-mongering.
Huh?
If you can't,
Okay. Can I? We're going in circles. Can I have another question, or would you like one?
Sure, if you want to take another one.
All right. So my question for you. This is on like. Let's see. This is another question on Iran. So.
Sure.
Let's see. Okay. So. Sorry. Let me. It's coming to my brain. Let's see. So you're saying that like Saudi and Iran, like we still tell you that Saudi-Iran talks failed, and we tell you that that's because like of the protests going on in Iran right now.
Well,
what would you say
there was
caused
only,
the
like-
protests in Iran?
Okay, so let's understand exactly the context. As I tried to elaborate earlier, the reason why these protests are kind of erupting was because this girl called.
No, we understand that, but why
Okay.
did
I thought you wanted me to bring through the step-by-step
No, I know, but
process.
why was the regime oppressing women?
Well, because that's how they've done it for the past 30 years. Like, why change now?
That's not. We tell you that in
Wait,
2013.
why do you think that they were oppressing women?
Well, they
Because
haven't
they're
been
trying to distract
oppressing
from
women for the past
sanctions.
30 or 40 years.
They have not.
Right, let's
So they
No.
try. Wait, sorry. So they
No.
were trying to distract from sanctions by then doing the better thing, which is just killing an innocent girl.
Wait,
Yes.
that doesn't
The
make
whole
sense.
point is no. The whole point is that the reason Iran is so
Okay,
oppressive
process over.
is because the reason Iran is so oppressive is because there's these sanctions and everyone is trying to revolt, so they have to like resort to these crazy measures.
We got 15 seconds.
Alright, let's play.
Okay. So when you do
Grand
crazy
process
measures
is
because
the
they're
Right.
the sanctions are putting their country out of control, so they have to like kill people and like suppress protests because otherwise they'll just get overthrown. Like the reason Iran is doing these like crazy like killings and stuff is because they're trying to keep power, desperately cling on to power because of the sanctions are disrupting their society. No.
You promise?
Yeah.
Alright. Overview about militarism and like peaceful diplomacy. The weighing, Daniel read in his summary. Iran, think about bias mediation, and the argument about regionalism. Is anybody not ready? Ready. Everyone good? Okay. On the overview, remember the disasters of the past are not the realities of the present. The United States may have been a fundamentally terrible actor in the past, but the Catullus evidence, which has gone conceded in every single speech, tells you that the United States right now is prioritizing peaceful diplomacy over military intervention. That's crucial because every single problem they've detailed in their case is because of military intervention that has nothing to do with peaceful diplomacy. On the way, they've conceded the fact that you should prioritize stopping existential risk. You can't have regionalism, you can't solve for issues if literally everybody's dead, which is why the GPP evidence indicates that we should prioritize it. Also, because in the status quo, they're going to say that, oh, there's a low probability, but that is the exact warranting as to why large risks go unaddressed in current policy, because people think, oh, it's too big of an issue, it will never actually happen. That's what the GPP evidence indicates, and it's gone conceded. That's why you should prioritize your ballot on which team best links into an existential risk. That's us. They don't have it. On Iran. Remember that diplomacy has historically worked. The nuclear deal failed because Trump pulled us out. That right now, though, these sanctions are in place, are decimating Iran, and that's why they're being forced to do other things to distract from these sanctions. They do have an incentive to actually join the nuclear deal because they want to get rid of sanctions. Remember, empirically it has worked. If their argument was true and the Iran never wants to join a nuclear deal, it should never have been passed in the first place. All of their words don't matter as far as empirically the historical narrative disproves that argument. But Trump is the only one who pulled us out. Remember that in the SQUO, we have stop and go talks which are insufficient and are leading Iran and are escalating tensions, which is going to culminate in a war that will bring in great powers and lead to an all-out war in the Middle East that will go conventional or go to a nuclear war. That's terrible because diplomacy has worked and will work. Don't let them come up here in second final and say that Iran violated the agreement in 2016. A, that's new. B, it's not true. On bias mediation. They've conceded the stark evidence that out of Dan's summary that bias mediation is actually good because the United States has a stake in the conflict that actually works to solving it. On regionalism, three things. First, remember that GCC and peacekeeping organizations have always failed. They haven't given you a single reason of what they've actually done. Two, every single speech has conceded the turnout of rebuttal that the United States actually fosters regional alliances, which if anything is a terminal turn on their case, because even if they say regional alliances are good, we are the only side that actually creates regional alliances. Lastly, their impact is terrible. It's about drone strikes because of militarism. Remember that the United States won't employ their military. It's peaceful diplomacy. Affirm.
Okay.
Oh, starting from now. I just wanted to determine the United States security guarantees is what caused Saudi Arabia to be enemies with Iran. And ultimately, when you saw those decrease, then you saw the ANI 21 card take effect. ANI 21 takes into effect because U.S. security guarantees decreased, right? So their entire argument is predicated on security guarantees. I brought that up in the last speech. Okay, I think that's it. Makes sense?
Yep. Is anybody not ready for my speech?
Totally ready.
Alright. The order is just going to be going over voter issues and clearing up the round. At the top on the overview, we're winning on our second link that they never respond to, the Fernie evidence that goes cold conceded that tells you that biased treaties cause the United States to have a 94% chance of failure. They only respond to the 94% card, which they give up in their final focus, meaning they agree with us that all diplomacy from the United States will have a 94% chance of failing. At that point, you don't flow any sort of marginal impact that they had coming from nuclear annihilation, because we see that we're already taking the extremely slim chances and we're bottling it down by 94%. At that point, we're winning on any sort of weighing level that they bring up in their first final focus. But let's go on to their overview where they talk about Afghanistan. Number one, Afghanistan is also not in the Middle East. I don't know where they think Afghanistan is. It's in Central Asia. But second, we'd also argue that it does matter because it doesn't give the signal of the Middle East, because the United States pulled out and when they failed in Afghanistan, which isn't in the Middle East. But then let's go on to regionalism. This is where you're signing your ballot. They claim that they gave you this turn that we didn't respond to, but Ronald clearly did with the Omni evidence that he reinstated in summary, where he tells you that because of U.S. security guarantees, that's why we saw that the talks failed. This is not a new turn or like a revolutionary turn. We see that regionalism still happens because of the sound principles that we give you in case when we explain to you that the U.S. protective shield leaves, and we've already seen Saudi Arabia and Iran cooperate. That's why we've seen historically that Saudi Arabia airstrikes dropped 80%, and that's why we see that 5 million people got their lives saved. At that point, we see that regional alliances are 6 times more durable, which means that we are winning the debate on probability of diplomacy getting solved. At that point, go on to Iraq. The key turn that goes cold conceded is that the U.S. bias means that countries are now going to look to things like Russia, which is in turn going to kill more people in a proxy conflict. At that point, we're winning, completely outweighing the 387,000 deaths card, because we see that proxy conflicts kill more. On contention 2 about Iran, look to their impact. It's really, really bad, because they claim that Iran is going to be this unrational actor like never seen before that's going to lead to a world nuclear war. But first, remember that we've seen unrational actors like North Korea and Russia at its prime, where we say that we've never seen a chance of nuclear miscalculation or nuclear war, but also we'd say that the Iranian nuclear deal, as my partner mentioned, was violated by Iran, meaning that the nuclear centrifuges were activated and they weren't like from the IND. For all these reasons, we strongly urge a negative ballot. Good debate, you guys.
Great job, guys. Well done.
Good debate. Good debate.
Good job, Chris.
Alright, maybe we'll see you guys in Elam. Hopefully.